All right, so this video is from 10 months ago. Obviously, you all know that colonization was a huge part of what allowed the Western European countries and the US to industrialize and develop capitalism first. And it's a major factor in why Africa is less developed, why Latin America is less developed. These countries were colonized for years. Then after World War II, there were all these independence movements, and all these countries supposedly gained sovereignty and gained independence. But through various methods that we call neocolonialism, Europe and the US have maintained control over the economies of many African and Latin American countries and continue to keep them in an underdeveloped state. Now, of course, this is something that China is trying to combat with the Belt and Road Initiative, offering all these developmental loans to African, Latin American, Middle Eastern, South Asian countries that are aimed at financing equity in these countries. Equity meaning money that makes money, investments that make money. So not debt trapping these countries like the US, the IMF, and the World Bank have done, the global Western dominated financial system, but rather giving these countries reasonable loans that they can pay back that are aimed at developing infrastructure, aimed at developing things that can help these countries be more prosperous in the future, raise their people out of poverty and such. And the interest rates for most of these Belt and Road Initiative loans are set around 4%. So if you know anything about US and European history, you know that the US did a similar thing for Europe after World War II. A lot of the industry had been destroyed by bombing and fighting. So the US offered Europe their allies in West Europe, a bunch of investment loans at about 4% interest. Basically the same thing China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. But the US, of course, wanted a buffer against the Soviet Union and the spread of communism, which is why they looked to build up their allies in West Europe. So yeah, we will get into this though without further ado. Feel free to send any super chats, and I will answer any super chat questions or respond to any comments as soon as we're done with this segment.
Well, you list here in one of your articles where you make reference to these rating systems, the bottom 10 countries for doing business in the world: Chad, Haiti, Central African Republic, Congo Democratic Republic, South Sudan, Libya, Yemen, Venezuela. There's a lovely example: Eritrea and Somalia. And so there are three exceptions.
Somalia? Why does he say everything so weird? And he has to hit on Venezuela too. Oh yeah, there's a great example of socialism. Venezuela, no iPhone. Like, the guy literally speaks in memes at this point while calling himself an academic.
In the African ecosystem, Mauritius, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia. You pointed out in your prospectus, is it prospectus article?
Prospectus article of
Right.
Institute.
Right, that Mauritius is a rising star. And Rwanda is in some ways comparable to Georgia. So some of these countries have started to get this right.
Yes.
And so what's the consequence of that? And what does right mean?
What they have understood, what these countries have understood, is that economic freedom is at the center for prosperity building. Rwanda, for example, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, is explicit about it. He said he wants to be the Lee Kuan Yew he wants to be the Singapore of Africa, and Lee Kuan Yew is his model. Now, the dirty mouths are going to start shouting, "Oh yeah, see."
So when they say freedom, when they say economic freedom is the key to prosperity, they mean free markets. They mean austerity, meaning no minimum wage, no unions, no social welfare programs, no nationalized industry that are made to invest in the country. Just free markets, which for Western multinationals, for companies and banks that are based in the West, means freedom of exploitation. Means very, very cheap labor and free access to African resources. Now, multinationals can get very prosperous when they are able to pillage foreign countries without having to invest any of the surplus back into those countries, just taking it as profit. So that's often what these people point to and say, look, they're succeeding economically. Look how well these multinational corporations are doing. But success for a multinational corporation doesn't necessarily mean a successful or more free economy for the working masses, of course. And in fact, a lot of the times what they mean by economic freedom is the opposite for the working masses of these countries. The more economic freedom means the more multinationals are able to pillage these countries, and the less the resources are invested into the people, and the less protections there are for laborers in these countries. So it's just a rhetorical trick, and this stems from the Koch brothers think tank called the Heritage Foundation, which created an economic freedom index where they rate countries based on how economically free they are. And if you break it down, it's literally just how much austerity they have, how much trickle-down economics they have. Freedom equals freedom of exploitation for multinationals. And that's the paradigm that they see the world through. And then, when other people don't buy into that nonsense, they go, oh, you just haven't studied economics. But in reality, the economics that they're using is just a fraud pseudoscience.
Now, the dirty mouths are going to start shouting, oh, yeah, see, authoritarian, blah, 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 whatever. Me, I want to talk only about the on the economic side. If you take Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore as your example.
Hey, we can agree on that. I promise not to call you an authoritarian, random lady.
Then it means that, like him, you're going to have to be serious about economic freedom. And that's exactly what he did. That's what Singapore did. When Singapore figured that out, they went on to put in the right reforms to make their environment some of the most business-friendly environments in the world, one of the most free markets environment in the world. And you saw the magic of Singapore. Today, Singapore is richer than its ex-colonizer, Great Britain. So when I hear people telling me today, oh, Africa is poor because of colonization, I'm like, please, let's move on from that. Does it have maybe a tiny percentage in where we are today? Maybe, and I don't know. But I know.
What do you mean you don't know? It wasn't even that long ago, lady. Of course it had something to do with Africa's poverty today. Of course colonization had something to do with it. And she says, I don't know. Like, you're admitting that you haven't studied it then. You're admitting that you haven't studied the effect that colonialism and neocolonialism had on the African economy. Like, why do you think the UK, France, Belgium, and all these European countries spent so much money and effort colonizing Africa and hanging on to these colonies and suppressing rebellions at every turn? It wasn't just for fun. It was for economic purposes. Economics were the driver of colonialism, the thirst for surplus and for profit, for exploitation. And we'll get more in depth on that later. Why make a statement if she doesn't know? Exactly. Right. She's admitting here that she hasn't studied colonization and then says, it's part of it because Singapore. Her example of Singapore is wrong. Yeah, I'm not a Singaporean expert, but I'm sure it is. So feel free to explain.
No, it's not the cause. Because if it were, many countless countries have been colonized before. And by the way, colonizing one another is humanity's history. It just happened that maybe Africa has been one of the last, colonized region in the world. So in our psyche, it is there and it acts like nothing happened before to others. But flash news, it's the history of the world. We've been capturing each other back and forth.
Okay. Colonization is the history of the world, and Africa is one of the places most recently colonized. Right, that doesn't imply that Africa's current state of being more impoverished than a lot of Western countries doesn't result from colonialism. Right, just because colonialism happened before in the past doesn't mean it's not happening now, and it doesn't mean it doesn't have economic effects. Right, she's saying it's clear in the psyche or whatever, but it's obvious for everybody to see. Right, it's obvious for everyone to see that Africa is incredibly rich when it comes to resources. Incredibly rich, richer than most Western countries. Yet when it comes to industrialization, development, bringing people out of poverty, combating things like hunger, they rank very low. Right? That is absolutely because of colonization. And like, why do you think, if it wasn't for colonization, why do you think Western countries took off so fast? Why do you think the European countries were able to develop and build all this industry, while equally wealthy African countries in terms of resources were not able to? Right? Well, why were they held in poverty while they were being held as British colonies? It's because their resources and labor, or the products of labor, were being extracted. They're being taken back to Europe to enrich private capitalists, individual capitalists, or corporations, rather than investing that surplus in economic development in the home country. Like, this is very, very, very basic colonial economics that this lady is just completely overlooking to give us some idealist phrases about freedom and about business interests.
All of that. So anyway, but the truth is, Singapore, richer than Great Britain today. And then Hong Kong happened. And then because Hong Kong happened, China even today happened. Because China's like,
bruh. No. Oh my God. China happened because Hong Kong. Hong Kong allowed for business freedom, so China decided to embark on a path of socialist economic planning and poverty alleviation. I love when they do this. I love when they say everything good that happened in China was because of the markets and the market reforms. Everything bad in China is because of socialism. And just completely ignore, the economic reality of what's happened in China. Ignore the fact that they have party cadres, Communist Party cadres, who are in charge of every single area in China. And they report back to the Central Committee, who creates an economic plan for the whole country. This is not capitalism, right? This is not something that this lady would consider business freedom or whatever. And they devise an economic plan based on the needs of the people. And then those cadres are in charge of making sure that every area has their needs met. So early on in the revolution, this was making sure that every area had food and water and that they were meeting the quotas for industrialization and development. But nowadays, it's making sure that people have Wi-Fi, making sure that people have clean and sustainable housing, right? Ensuring that each of these areas is able to thrive and meet their people's needs, which is why China is the only country on earth that has abolished relative poverty, right? This is why in New York, in the US, even in this massively wealthy city where Wall Street is located, so billions and billions and billions of dollars in wealth, you still have thousands of people sleeping on the streets. You still have subways that are dirty and that are breaking down, right? Because capitalism will never abolish poverty. Everywhere where that wealth accumulates under capitalism, poverty accumulates as well. China has combated this with socialism. Right. So to say that they got rich because of Hong Kong and because of capitalism is silly. Right. They allowed for some capitalist markets so that they could develop themselves using the wealth that was already in the West. But that wealth was heavily controlled. They were only allowed, or multinationals were only allowed to invest in specific financial zones that were determined by the party. So this was all due to central planning. And let's get into some of the stuff that I have about Africa here. Like I said, if the colonial powers, if colonization is not the reason Africa is more poor than the West, why do you think they colonized Africa for so long? Why do you think the U.S. maintains an entire system of drone warfare and hundreds of military bases in Africa through AFRICOM, Africa Command? Why do you think they do that? You think it's really to combat terrorism, even though we know that in many cases, 90% of the intended targets being killed by U.S. drone strikes were civilians? No, of course not. It's to enforce U.S. economic interests because corporations control our government and they have an economic interest in exploiting these countries. So if you want the quintessential sort of book for Westerners to understand how Africa was underdeveloped and originally colonized, check out How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. This is very, very good. Excellent book that a lot of people have recommended. But we also have specific examples even after the era of colonialism, right? After these countries supposedly gained their independence, we have cases like Libya, where their leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was overthrown by Hillary Clinton, Obama, and NATO, which took Libya from one of the most prosperous, one of the richest nations in all of Africa, which they didn't do, by the way, by giving freedom to businesses, by promoting business freedom. They did it through socialism explicitly. That's what Gaddafi said in his Green Book. And they did it through central economic planning and making sure that their people's needs were met. It wasn't Marxism-Leninism, but it was a Libyan form of socialism, right? So they became one of the most prosperous countries in all of Africa, but were turned into a country with no central government, an open-air slave market, extreme poverty, and constant civil war. But guess what? Western multinationals have access to all of Libya's resources. Their resources. So a blatant example within the last decade of colonization destroying a country and taking them from being very rich to very poor. But please, lady and Jordan Peterson, tell me more about how colonization isn't what made Africa poor. Explain Libya then, you absolute corporate shills. If colonization didn't make Africa poor, please explain to me what happened in Libya. Why did they get so poor after their government was toppled by the Clintons and Obama? Also, Gaddafi had plans to create a central African bank, which would be aimed at industrial development and poverty alleviation, making Africa rich, combating the years of colonialism that have kept Africa in poverty. So guess what they did? They killed him, because colonialism is the reason there's poverty in Africa. Also, an estimated 100 to 200 million dollars in Libyan reserves were stolen by Western corporations and have never been given back. But that's not why they're poor. It's because Gaddafi wasn't friendly enough to Western banks. Like, pull your head out of your ass or stop lying for money, Jordan Peterson and this random lady. Or what about the Lion of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba? Another hero of Africa with all sorts of plans for economic development, all sorts of plans for developing the industry of his country. He was overthrown in a coup that was backed by the US and Belgium and replaced by Mobutu Sese Seko, whom the word kleptocracy was named after. Kleptocracy means a corrupt autocratic dictatorship where the leadership of a country uses that country's resources to enrich themselves and Western multinationals who are backing them. Right? So they overthrew this guy who wanted to develop the Congo, who wanted to invest in the people, and replaced them with a kleptocracy, with an autocratic dictator who took all the money and lived on a mansion and handed the rest off to Western multinationals. You don't think that that kept the Congo poor? Well, then you're an idiot. I don't know what else to tell you, because it absolutely did. It ruined Lumumba's plans for economic development in the Congo and all of Africa, because he was a Pan-Africanist, by the way. And you killed him and replaced him with a guy who hoarded all the resources for himself. That made them poor. That made them poor. It was being too friendly to Western business interests. Moving on. Amit Sankara. Again, this is all these people were killed after their countries gained independence. Or, these were oftentimes the leaders who led their countries in independence struggles, in the case of Sankara and Lumumba. But then, the US was fine. Okay, fine. You can have your independence. You can have your sovereignty. You can have your own flag. But you can't take control of your economy. Right? And when these people tried to develop, when they tried to invest in industry and bringing people out of poverty and raising their economy, their economic standing, that's when they were killed in coups. Because it is colonialism that keeps countries in Africa poor. Duh. So Sankara planted trees, combated corruption, gave equal rights to women, launched vaccination campaigns, and most importantly, invested in development. Invested in development and industry, which is why the French and the US killed him in a coup, cut them up into little pieces and buried them in scattered places, and then had this autocratic dictator named Blaise Compaoré rule the country for the next 20 years, where Western multinationals would pillage their resources. But that's not why they're poor, right? I'm sure it has nothing to do with it. And as we mentioned, There's, of course, AFRICOM, where the U.S. maintains this giant I thought there was a map of the AFRICOM bases on here, but the U.S. maintains this giant, expensive system of drone surveillance and drone warfare over Africa in order to control their resources and make sure they remain in the hands of Western multinationals. This is also why Joe Biden has been bombing Somalia and why he just launched troops into Somalia. It wasn't just for fun. It wasn't just because Joe Biden doesn't really like Somalia. It was for resources, to take their resources back to the West. Colonialism, which is why Africa doesn't have as many resources or doesn't have as much industry, and the West does. It's because we took it. We took it from them. That's what colonialism was. Yes, that's why they're poor, or poorer than us. Although they're making great strides to develop themselves thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative and other reasons. But, and like I said, this is just neo-colonialism. This is just colonialism and controlling the economies of countries who are supposedly sovereign and independent. But you had overt colonialism all the way up until, after World War II was when all these independence struggles started. So you had overt colonialism where African countries were ruled over by European countries. And you don't think the European countries were stealing the resources? And you don't think that has anything to do with why European countries got super rich and why African countries were held in poverty despite equal amounts of resources? Like, how stupid can you be? How stupid can you actually be? You don't think the Belgian King Leopold cutting off the hands of Congolese people who didn't work hard enough had anything to do with why Africa's poor? And guess what? Those people who are working for King Leopold in the Congo, they're not working to produce something that then is invested in them, invested in their own country. Belgium is taking those resources back to Europe. So the surplus that's produced in the colonized countries gets sucked out and brought over to the West. That is why they're poor. That is why King Leopold cut people's hands off if they didn't work hard enough. It wasn't because he really cared about the people of the Congo and he knew if people worked harder, their surplus would be invested in them. No, he was trying to steal more and more of their resources. The entirety of Kenya was controlled by Britain, which incited the Mau Mau rebellion that was brutally suppressed by the British. And the UK lied about their atrocities there for years. They also held the Cape Colony, which was basically just the southern cone of Africa, this giant portion of what's now South Africa that was completely controlled by the UK. So of course, all those that incredibly resource-rich area was having their resources and labor extracted by the British for years and years and years. Angola and Mozambique, very similar situations, two incredibly resource-rich countries that were held by Portugal for years. You, of course, have Algeria, which was colonized by France, and this has led to one of the greatest movies of all time, The Battle of Algiers, which apparently this lady on Jordan Peterson's show has never watched. So you don't think all of these events, which I'm just scratching the surface of all the colonization that happened, you don't think that's what kept Africa poor and helped Europe get rich? It absolutely is. In fact, economic exploitation was the basis for all of this colonialism. It was not just for fun, right? It was the basis of colonialism. Without the drive to super exploit Africa, without the drive to steal their resources, there would be no colonialism. That was the whole damn point. Like, honestly, what are these people on? What are you on? I know what you're on. You're on think tank money. You're on NGO money. You're being paid by billionaires to lie, say that colonization did not hurt Africa. And in fact, all they need to do is just hand over the continent to Western multinationals and all of a sudden they'll be rich. You scummy, scummy liars. Disgusting liars. Propagandists for the ruling, the murderous, torturing, imperialist ruling class of our current global capitalist system. And, that will be your legacy here on this earth. Will be lying to people, lying to the working masses on behalf of corporations who rob and steal and kill to get what they want.
Wait a minute, what went on over there? And then China went on to do the exact same thing with its SEZs, the special economic zone.
And it's just such idealism too. Singapore's rich. Singapore's rich. China's rich. Guess it wasn't colonialism. You haven't proved anything. You haven't proved anything. This would get a D if you were in 3rd grade. If this was an essay that you wrote for your 3rd grade elementary school class. Because you're not proving anything. You're just saying, look at Singapore. They have a lot of money. Look at China. They have a lot of money. It must be because they handed over their resources to Western multinationals, which no, they freaking didn't. So you're lying about that too. But you're not even saying anything. You're not even making a coherent argument.
Some of the most free market zones in the world. And then look at it happen in communist China, who, when it comes to economics, decided that we're going to do the free market, we're going to be capitalist, because that's the only way. We tried everything else. We killed hundreds of millions of people, and we have nothing to show for it.
Look at this fucking idiot, dude. Yeah, China's fully capitalist today. This laugh proves that Jordan Peterson is a fraud.
Millions of people, and we have nothing to show.
Agree with anything that fits his ideology, but who doesn't study and engage with the things he's actually talking about. Because if the U.S. started implementing the policies that China has today, these guys would be freaking out. They would be like, "What about the free market? What about my free market?" Because what China does is they have Communist Party members sitting on the boards of all the major corporations. And all the major corporations have to fall in line, including the Western corporations invested in China. They have to fall in line with what the state central plan is. They have to fall in line with the plan that's been laid out for development in China. They don't have freedom to exploit the same way that they do in Western countries. Right? And if the U.S. started doing this, if a Communist Party was in power in the U.S., and controlling what all the business interests did, you would not call that free market capitalism. But you do it with China so you can lie and take credit for all the good things that China's done. Right? China, look at what they did to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party. The leader of their country said that we are following the Marxist worldview. Right? And Marxism has brought us to this place where we've alleviated poverty. But you guys just claim it's capitalist because it's convenient to support China nowadays because they've brought everybody out of poverty. I can't do it with the lobster man anymore. It's so sick to me that we live in a society where people like Jordan Peterson are considered intellectual icons. Where this absolute child of a man, this buffoon who spends all day on Twitter, is considered a public intellectual, a leading intellectual, and he knows nothing about the subject he is talking about here. Nothing other than ideological jibber jabber and State Department talking points. Nothing. I mean, if there used to be anything valuable in Jordan Peterson's work, it's completely gone ever since he left the university and turned to these libertarian and Republican think tanks for his money. I mean, what a disgusting, sick man.